And then are you also not getting promoted, or you weren't even thinking about promoted, you just wanted to keep doing the work? Or were they slowing your career trajectory a little too in that chill?
In terms of my career goals, I think I was at the pinnacle. I was the investigative reporter for CBS News. I think at some point the only one they had doing full-time investigative reporting. Loved that job. It was just a plumb awesome job. Spent almost my full time doing that. So I was where I wanted to be. I was getting big contracts and salary increases. So on the one hand, I was encouraged or being encouraged. And then on the other hand, I would feel this big chill with a lot of my stories that were very important, I felt, not making air, and that was discouraging. I mean, to convince a whistleblower on a very important issue who works, for example, inside a federal agency, to tell a story that's probably going to destroy his career and to some extent his personal life, and then when the story doesn't air, to have to go back to that person and say nobody cares after all, it's just, it chips away at your heart, to have to do that time and time again. And I didn't feel like I could just keep doing it.
Wow. Well, we look back in history at the moment when we allowed these advertisements on mainstream television as one of the worst moments in human history, that it empowered so many bad things to happen. And when did that actually happen? What was the year that kind of turned on?
I'd say around the 2004-2005 time period. And I'm not sure the advertising in itself is at fault. It's the failure on our part as an industry to create a firewall on the front end where it couldn't interfere. I always argued if we were to go back to these advertising interests, and in some cases political interests, that try to influence our reporting, and instead of when they call responding to them, if we had a policy where we were to say, we can't talk to you about this. If you have a complaint, put it in writing and there's a process to follow, but we can't engage with you in this kind of push me, pull you over, you'll get an exclusive interview if you don't air this investigation. We should never have engaged in the conversation. And very early on, I go to these investigative seminars and meetings and conferences, and I started saying years ago when I recognized this and that it was happening industry-wide, not just at CBS, I said we need to have sessions on this topic and how to protect ourselves as an industry or we're going to lose our credibility. And the people who were organizing these conferences were apparently not interested and never held this discussion. Interestingly, during the same time period, I went to a journalism conference in Moscow where this stuff was discussed, oddly enough, and was happening around the world similarly as to what was happening in the United States. And they were trying to address this trend, not just advertising trends, but political problems with people, anyone who's going off the establishment narrative, whether it was right or left, journalists suffering personal attacks and career hits and so on. It was addressed in that Moscow journalism conference in a way I never heard it discussed in the United States. And to this day, I don't think it's taken, well, now it's too late. I just feel like those who are influencing us on the outside now have been invited into our newsrooms and they work within the news organizations, and there's really no way to sever those interests anymore.
Wow. I worked in banking for a long time, and they have something called the Chinese wall in banking. So if you work at Goldman Sachs, you've got the analyst department that decides to cover that stock and to be critical of whether it's a good or bad stock to buy. And then you get the other department that's involved with the CEO and the CFO to help them raise money and sell bonds and sell stock. And there's supposedly a wall where they don't talk to each other and there's no influence. And no one says, hey, can you give them a good review because we're about to... But they're always a little looked upon with suspicion because in the long enough timeline, a lot of times those conflicts, they don't get resolved in the right way.
Yeah.
Do you think that in a long enough timeline that happens as well? Or you think you really could have set up like that Chinese wall equivalent?
There could have been. There just wasn't the desire because ultimately the interest of the corporation that runs the news division is different than the interest of the news division. And there came a time since I've been in the news business for 40 plus years, news was not expected to earn a big profit. It was taken on as something that was a public responsibility. Hopefully it made some money, but that was not the primary goal. And it became where news more had to be a money-making venture. And once that happened, there was an expectation on the corporate level that news was not something that they were going to lift up and hold if it didn't make a lot of money. The news had to start catering more to sponsors. So let's say a friend of mine told me in a Today Show meeting for NBC in the morning meeting, there was a discussion by the head of news at the time how to make a fingernail polish that they would promote on the show that was linked to a sponsor that they hoped to get for the Today Show. So they're doing things to cater to sponsors rather than to cover the news. And once you do that, what are your news topics going to be? Well, they're not going to be a lot of things, and your news topics will be a lot of sort of promotional related things. And I think that's where Full Measure, what we try to do is cover the stories that people aren't covering because they're not looking for ground level news anymore. They're covering what other people are wanting them to cover to push a certain agenda or narrative or advertiser or whatnot.
Hey, I know investing in crypto is scary. It takes a real leap of faith because there are so many scams, rug pulls, and bad actors out there. It's a dangerous business, which is why 95% of people lose all their money. Well, that's why I created the London Real Investment Club, so you can access the hottest deals on the planet and use the crypto bull market to create the generational wealth that you deserve. Join my team of over 100 people from around the world that are making millions of dollars behind the scenes investing in blockchain, AI, Web3 games, DeFi, Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out. Click the link below to book a call with one of my team now. But hurry, this bull market will end soon.
I know investing in crypto can be scary. That's why you gotta join the investment club. Pull the trigger. Let's do this.